with the Jarvis Project, and I'm joined with me again today by Courtney from the IV Investor. How are you doing today, Courtney?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. So for everyone who's out there that's tuning in today's video, we are going to continue our conversation from last week, which I thought got really interesting, where we're going to talk more about these blank check investment companies. But first, I wanted to get your opinion, Courtney, on something that's been on my mind and is probably on the minds of a lot of people. And the question I want to ask is, are we in a market bubble right now? And the reason why I ask is, if you look around, over the last couple of weeks, January especially, cannabis companies and the market in general has just been great. I have a little weighted average of, you might call it, the top cannabis companies that I track. And just in the month of January, that average is up 50%, which is, the S&P's done well, almost 7 or 8%, but 50% growth in a month is huge. So now the question is, before I turn it over to you, is it too late to get in?
No, I definitely don't think it's, I don't think it's too late to get in, but I think with the movement in January, it really should make investors to be a little bit more cautious and thoughtful about their investments and where they're getting in. I do think that we could be possibly on a bubble, but I also think, to kind of back up a little bit, I think it's really important that we talk about kind of bubbles. Bubbles usually happen where there's kind of over exuberance in the market, people are allowing their emotions to get ahead of what we call the fundamentals of the business. However, with cannabis, I think it's a good thing and a bad thing, is that there's some real live changes and shifts in the industry that kind of started to go live, that were going live in January, namely, the passage, and I talk about this all the time, the passage of the Farm Bill, but also kind of the changes that are going on across the nation and even worldwide about the changing climate and thought about cannabis. And so I think there is some exuberance. So let me clarify. So I think there is some exuberance, but I do think that it's well-founded. Half-founded in truth, half in fiction. So I think it's a truth and fiction thing going on.
No, that's interesting. I guess we all have our opinions. I define bubbles. I have this rule I call the Uber driver rule. And when the Uber driver starts asking me about things and starts giving me advice, I'm not saying that Uber drivers are bad. I've got some friends that are Uber drivers. I think they're great. But when the Uber driver, I was actually in an Uber, and someone asked me what I did, and you get that conversation, and he started talking about Tilray. And while that's great and everything, and for everyone out there, there's Tilray, there's, call it the big three, right? Tilray, Cronos, and Canopy Growth. I like cannabis. I'm actually still long and bullish on the industry. All I know, though, is when everyone's talking about Tilray or everyone's talking about Canopy Growth, they're not bad investments. There probably still is a lot to, there might still be some upside on that. But I'm looking at it as, I want to go to where the puck is going to be, right? I want to find that next Tilray. I want to find the Canopy Growth. 2 years ago, Canopy Growth was great. There was no really pre-IPO for Tilray. But I want to find those people, and I firmly believe that there's a lot of opportunity on those. And this goes back to, your insight last week about the regulatory side and everything on that front. But I'm the type of person is, when the Uber driver's talking about it, it tells me it's good news and it's bad news. It's good news because the market, it shows me that there's some level of mass adoption going on in the market, so the awareness is there. So that's good, right? Because if no one's talking about it, or if there's really no market, we could be buying something that's going nowhere, right? So you want to be in a growth market. So that's the good news. The bad news, or the better news, is I have to do a little more homework, and I just want to figure out, okay, let me think this through, right? Canopy Growth is big. Tilray is big. They're out there. Who are they going to need? Who are they going to use? Who are they going to have to buy? What are all the things they're going to have to do to get to that next point because those are the companies that people don't know about, or those are the companies that aren't that, the market isn't aware of. And that's where the opportunity is. Not sure what your thoughts are, or what you think, being that regulatory person.
No, I definitely agree with you. And I think I love picks and shovels plays. Like, I'm a big picks and shovels person. And I do think generally, like, I'm really excited about the industry generally, especially kind of showing that mass adoption that you talked about earlier. But I do think that the sexier things are going to, so I think we can draw a line in the sand. So for the things that are sexy and interesting that everyone's talking about, I think we may be in a bubble. Like I said, because I think there's a lot of things going on. But I think on the other side, on what we call the picks and shovels plays, the ancillary businesses, we're not there yet. Part of the reason being is that most people don't know them. They don't exist. To them, they don't exist. It's just like, when we think cannabis, we think growers. And that's it. I mean, the average person doesn't even think about like a GWPH, GW Pharmaceuticals, which is GWPH, their symbol. Well, we're not even thinking about that because that's not what we think about when we think about cannabis. We're not looking there. So these growers, what's going to actually make the industry work? I think that's where we definitely should be going. And I think we're not in a bubble when it comes to those, because like I said, for a bubble to even exist, people have to know it is even there. And I don't think people even really understand the back business of cannabis.
No, I agree. So let's, hop into one of these. I don't know if you want to start or if I want to talk, but for people that were tuning in, I see right now, I like what you're saying. I see two interesting opportunities right now on but there's two that I'm focusing on in terms of, where I'm putting my head. One is, and it really stuck with me, what you told me about the regulatory stuff last week. So I really started geeking out. How you kind of played the prison, the for-profit prison game. That really influenced me. So I actually have done some research, and specifically you brought up another point. I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but you gave me this information that I didn't really think about, the fact that if you are a U.S. producer, you actually can't be listed on the TSX or the NASDAQ exchange, because it's technically, there's some gray area on that. Right? I think you told me that. I don't know if it was last week or the week before. Right. So there's that little hole. So I'm thinking it's like, well, this is interesting, right? Because everyone knows the U.S. market is supposedly the big market. I mean, well, the U.S. is the number one consumption economy in the world. So you would assume for everything else, that would be the number one consumption economy. And everyone, when we're talking about investing in cannabis companies, is all about, let's get these Canadian companies because that's where they're at, right? So you've got all these big companies, whether it's, or big-ish, big market cap companies. In terms of actual revenues, they're not there. But big market cap companies, Tilray, Canopy Growth, Cronos Group, and the list goes on and on. But what I was doing was, I started actually putting some numbers together. And I think I read a report, 2018, they estimated $10 billion or, give or take some, and that's the legal market. This year they're aiming for, I think 13 billion. So, that's a big number. And if you really think about it though, that number is not represented almost at all in this public market. Think about that. Canopy Growth's revenues, and I don't have it, but maybe let's pull up, we always like looking at the stock charts, right? Yeah. Let me see if I can pull this up. But if I recall, Canopy Growth's revenues were they're trading at some massive valuation. It's just crazy massive. And let me go pull this up while we get Yahoo up. But if I look up Canopy Growth, let's see, Canopy Growth Corporation, and everything is dying on me right now as the Zoom share goes crazy on that. But if I look at, Canopy Growth has they've got a $16 billion market cap. You say, okay, well, one of the big companies has, if it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, okay, $1 billion or a $10 billion market cap makes sense. But if I really dive into the financials of Canopy Growth, I mean, their annual revenues were only $78 million. Now, only is a relative term, but if you look at this in the grand scheme of this cannabis industry, which, legal is still mostly, let's say it's US, it's primarily probably US based. And in US, it's mostly Denver, mostly Colorado, and now California is getting big, and you've got these other medical markets coming out. Let's say the US market, I don't know if it's all 10 billion, let's say it's at least half of that, maybe $5 billion or 6 billion, whatever that number is. One of the biggest cannabis companies has no market share in the biggest market, and even their revenue percentage of 77 million against $5 billion. I mean, that's not even, that's a rounding error almost. That's barely, do you see what I mean?
Yeah. But so you're funny on the rounding error. But I think it's really important that we're looking at the date here. So these numbers are as of March 31st.
Okay, and that's valid. So let's go quarterly.
Yeah, so let's look for and see, and even still, that's as of September 18. That doesn't roll. Remember, they rolled out mid fourth quarter. That's when actually cannabis became legal. These are all basically, let me back up. These are all medical marijuana numbers. This is not the recreational side, because
this is correct. That's Canada, but none of this is US.
Oh, no, none of it's US. But I just think I'm really curious. I'm going to be really poised looking at the next quarter, which they should be rolling out these numbers soon, for the quarter ending December 2018. And then more importantly, and I think this is going to be like a big determining factor, is that quarter ending March 2019, because that's going to be your first real quarter where we get a chance to look at what a recreational market looks like on any scale. But to your point, this is just Canada. This is just Canada. But I think that will give us an idea of what maybe because Canada is like a fraction of the U.S. market, but that will at least give us an idea of what these numbers may look like, if that makes sense.
No, I agree. And I agree with everything you're saying. What I'm trying to say is, as I look for cannabis companies or cannabis opportunities, everyone is thinking, oh, buy cannabis. Let me buy some Tilray. Let me buy some Canopy Growth, right? Because Constellation Brands did that. But they're this. The market is US. That's that market. You've got a market in the US. Maybe it's 5 billion. Maybe it's 7 billion. Maybe it's 3 billion. It's some number that is a lot bigger. Right. And it exists today because people are consuming cannabis. Kush Bottles is selling packaging materials to everybody. IIPR, one of the cannabis REITs, is out there leasing all this land to people. They're not just sitting there losing money. And this is what got me thinking on the regulatory side is I feel there's this regulatory hole, because you've got all these US companies that actually have market share and have revenue that are legalized, but they're kind of in that quasi environment. And I want to figure out, how do I get into those people, or where do I find those opportunities? Because I'm not saying that Canopy couldn't make it or Tilray couldn't make it or anything. Like they're probably all, they're all exciting companies, but the market's already priced in some massive upside for them, right? And this is the thing, and I find this, I like the investing side, even though, I invest a lot, but I like it not as like, there's the company fundamental side. But one of the things I learned was investing there's almost an element of game theory, or you have to like you're investing based on what others are doing or what they're not doing. Do you see what I mean? Because you could buy a really good, fundamentally strong company, but because the public loves them, or because the market is, or because they've made a big splash, everyone is in on them, and the upside isn't that good. So even though the company could be around, the valuation could be a little high. Does that make sense?
No. I definitely, it does make sense. It does make sense, is that the market is already calculated a part of it. Kind of calculate this, kind of baked in that idea or those concepts in the numbers. So I'm with you. Yeah.
So this is what I did, and would love to, maybe we can poke at this a little. So this goes, let's tie in regulatory We're going to tie in, for people who are still trying to figure out what we're talking about, we're going to talk more about these blank check companies. We're going to talk about all these other avenues. But what I did was I went out and just kind of did some relative valuation numbers of companies. Mm-hmm. And more interestingly, or more important, can you see my screen okay, Courtney?
Yeah. I see it.
Okay.
It's great.
But what I did was I grouped them based on the type of exchanges that they're actually on. So if you think about it, I'm not saying these are perfect, but you can think of it like one is a better exchange, the other is, an okay exchange, and then the final is like the best exchange out there. And I'm talking about this in terms of liquidity. And I don't know if I have a conclusion here, but if you just look at it, right, the US exchanges, which, NASDAQ and NYSE, these are exchanges that everyone can get in, right? If I'm buying something on the NASDAQ or if I'm buying something on the NYSE, I mean, the infrastructure is built out pretty well. You just go to your Robinhood or your Stash app or, whatever app you have, you literally click 3 buttons and then you can go buy shares of those companies. Right. And if you look at the numbers, look at these multiples. You've got revenue multiples of 200 times revenue. And this is not even earnings numbers. These are revenue numbers, right? 260 times, 240 times, Cronos at 500 times. I mean, those are insane. I mean,
yeah, and it's funny, I was having, this is not necessarily, it's market related, but not necessarily cannabis related. So I was having a conversation about access. And access and we keep looking at the markets and saying, oh, the market's never been this high before. The market's never done this before. We've had these conversations, but I've noticed that the market has hit these numbers based on access. So 10 years ago, I don't know if we talked about this here, but 10 years ago, it was really kind of not necessarily difficult. I'll go 15 years. When I first became a stock, when I first got my Series 7, about 15 years ago, it was relatively hard to purchase stocks online, and it was super expensive. But I think one of the things that I've seen in the last 15 years is that the market has become a lot more accessible. And I think the market, by being more accessible, has become more irrational because you have more minds kind of in the pot that may or may not, because I think there was and this is not a bad thing. I mean, I'm not making it as a bad thing, but just as an observation is that at one point you kind of had like the institutional money there. And you had some institution, you had pensions, you had kind of like, I don't want to call it like big money people there. But now that you have like kind of like anybody, like the market's accessible to anyone, like I can, like you just said, you can go to Robinhood, get on your app, click a couple buttons and boom, I'm in the market. How has that changed? And then I start looking, and when you showed the US valuations in terms of kind of the earnings multiples and revenue multiples, you're like, those are astronomically high. So how has kind of the accessibility of the markets changed these numbers? And I was just kind of thinking that, like, I really feel like because more people in the market, these numbers are going to start to get more and more further away from kind of what we call the hard numbers, or kind of like the fundamentals of the company. Does that make sense?
No, that does. I think we could make that a topic for next week, because that's an entirely different rabbit hole. Are we in a equity bubble? Because PE ratios are higher than ever, and debt keeps fueling. I mean, let's not go there right now.
You definitely, but I thought it was just something to bring up, because when I saw that.
No. I think it's great, and I would be happy to dive into this, because that's something. I've also personally been looking a little bit at gold more.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, primarily because it's like, when you read this stuff and you look at just kind of your economic trends and you look at debt ratios of the country, I mean, I don't know if you saw Trump's new plan. Trump's the guy that said he's going to reduce deficits, and our deficit's probably going to go up a couple $1 trillion. I mean, talk about, that's, what was it? It's like the George Bush, read my lips, no new taxes. And then he had new taxes, right? So, I mean, it's kind of the same thing. So there's a side of me, and I'm not saying I'm all out and I'm looking at cash or anything, but there's a side of me that wonders, are we in the 6th or 7th inning of a 9-inning stretch? Because economies go in cycles. It's just feasibly like laws of science or human behavior. Things cannot always go up. Like there has to be some sort of a credit cycle that occurs with all this. And yeah, I mean, they've kind of backed off on the quantitative easing, so it's a little better and they're not just printing money like they were before. But that's, that's an issue. Now there's the second thing that says, well, the US is a reserve. I mean, like we can go on and all about that. Now, I think to bring it back though, my takeaway and how I looked at this is based on accessibility. And now, you want to talk a little bit about whether it's game theory or everything. You've got this large base of just regular people who aren't really doing all the research, who aren't really kind of like, who don't understand everything. And the regular person now knows cannabis is going to be big, right? Maybe before they were thinking, oh, it's a bunch of druggies. Now they're opening their minds. Oh, it's a solution for opioids. Oh, there's a social justice component. Oh, hemp has been legal. Like they're thinking all this stuff is in their head. And because they're thinking of all that stuff is in their head, they're going to say, well, I know this is going to be big. They're thinking also, oh, well, if I put some money in the market, do I really want to go into Apple? I don't know. Facebook? I don't know. Netflix? That's kind of going where it is. I'll throw a few bucks into some of the cannabis companies, and they'll just go and say, okay, we've got cannabis. It's ease and accessibility, right? So that's happening. Right. And while I still believe, is there upside for Tilray and is there upside for Canopy Growth? I mean, yeah, there could be. I'm not saying there isn't. There's upside for those companies. Like if I look at risk reward ratios, that's not that's a little risky for me. I'm already risking on the cannabis side. If I want less risky, I'd go with, I don't know, Verizon, right? Or something like, do you see what I mean? So like cannabis side's already risky. So like I'm pushing my risk level in my asset allocation side, but I don't want to look at that. So I'm like, okay, can I find a company that's in the space, but isn't ready to or isn't at the mark, isn't at like the main market dynamic, right? And if you look at it a year ago or a year and a half ago, that was Canopy Growth and Cronos. They were just, small little companies listed on the TSX exchanges or some of these other Canadian exchanges. And then as they moved their listing over to NASDAQ or NYSE, they really started to pop, right? Can I look at that? Or can I look at other opportunities that people aren't thinking, but then just make sense? So I'll give you an example. And I think we had talked about this, but I opened a position back in November in a newly listed, they were like a month old, but a newly listed Colombian producer of cannabis. And it's interesting because if you talk to, generally speaking, I'm not that hot on the publicly traded producers right now because it's like their valuations are crazy. But this was a Colombian one. And the reason why was I was looking at the market and everyone's got this idea. It's like Canada is going to become the #1 exporter of cannabis in the world and they're going to take over and oh my gosh. And I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, let's think this through for a second. For starters, Canada's really cold. It just is. It's cold and there's a lot of, yeah, you could probably farm in Canada, but if you actually look at how most of the cannabis is grown in Canada, they're growing them, they're building these greenhouses, they're building these internal structures. These are not simple structures to build. These are expensive. And there's something about farming where if you can use the sun and the climate to your advantage, it's not a big problem. The other thing too with cannabis is there isn't that local dynamic that one finds to their advantage. Because if it was fresh produce, right? There's value add, if I'm growing a strawberry and you can have the strawberry that's plucked off the bush 3 days later, or for leafy greens, because lettuce goes bad really quick. Cannabis in most consumption isn't consumed wet, it's dried out. So a geographic advantage of having a local flavor of cannabis. I mean, there probably still are fringe cases, but for like the mass market, the local advantage isn't quite there. So I got into thinking, I was like, okay, well, if this is just a dried crop that's going to be, when cannabis, it gets harvested, they dry the stuff out, and then they either extract or they do something with it, where are the major producers of agriculture located? And I mean, so this is going back, 6 months or whatever. Where's the major producers? Well, you look at coffee, you look at flowers, you look at all that stuff. All that stuff is in Central America. So I actually took a pretty decent position in a Colombia, and then it's in Central America. What are the two main countries? There's Uruguay and there's Colombia. So I took a position in a Colombian company that had relatively recently listed. And I said, this just makes sense, right? They grow a lot of flowers. They've legalized it there. They're trying to become a big exporter. All these things are going on. And I mean, I'm not one to, I mean, there's an element of luck in all this stuff too, right? Because no one's ever perfect. But I mean, since I think it was November when I entered the position, I'm up 100%. So I'm doing really well, because it's like now the market has realized that's like, oh my gosh, actually, Canada is not going to ship cannabis everywhere, because it just doesn't, they have a short-term advantage, but it's not going to make sense because all the producers are going, and now you see like Canopy Growth or Aurora, all these guys, they're buying these Colombian facilities, or they're trying to get into Uruguay, or they're trying to get into South America, because they realize that's where you can grow this stuff. Because, whether it's coffee, whether it's flowers, it all comes from Central America because the climate's just better. Sorry, didn't mean to go off, but
no. That was actually a very good point. And I was listening to some kind of podcast. I don't remember whose podcast it was, but apparently there's a place in South Africa that actually grows cannabis, and actually grows it in it's a good climate for cannabis. I just don't remember where it is. And I think it may not be South Africa itself, but like a kingdom inside of South Africa. But same thought process, same exact thought process, saying, listen, who has the best competitive advantage when you look at it overall? And I think one of the biggest things that we need to look at is looking at it from, not even from seed to sale, but actually looking like who has the best ability to grow the plant. And to your point, all of these other things is kind of overhead really eats into your profit. Like I have to put on lights. I mean, we talk about lights, we have to do, certain types of hydroponics. We have to do all of this other stuff to kind of make this work in a climate where it just doesn't really naturally work. And that's okay. But again, that starts to eat into our profit. So you want a play that actually has the ability to make more profit. But I think, he talked about something very interesting that I think is going to get us into the blank check company. Is I think you said, cannabis is relatively speculative. And just to talk about the blank check company, they're relatively speculative too. So I think we could probably start talking about them kind of looking at like the cannabis universe and what's going on. Are you ready to jump into them?
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, it's a great segue. So I think for a lot of people out there, and I'm going to defer to you on this because, you're a lawyer and, that like you dig through all this stuff. Let me give a high level view and then you can kind of explain it. So from my end, let me ask the question and you can kind of explain it to me, right? So my understanding is these blank check companies are forming because there's a bit of a regulatory mismatch right now for most cannabis companies. They can't just list on the exchanges. Like there's stuff that they have to do. And what a blank check company offers is it's taking care of all the stuff involved to get it going. And then they will go, and when the tides turn, or when the stuff is legalized fully, they can move quickly instead of having to go through a 6-month or a 9-month or a 1-year process for listing. Now, is that a pretty good thing, or do you want to maybe dive into it more? And
yeah, no. You actually covered it pretty well. Just to kind of put it in perspective, in terms of the blank check company, let me go back for a second. So 2017 was kind of like one of the biggest years for IPOs since the great market crash. But 20% of those companies that IPO'd in 2017, or at least prepared to IPO in 2017, 20% of them were blank check companies. To kind of put perspective in what a blank check company is that it's also called a special acquisition company, and it's like an SPAC or something that they call it. And it's focused, the whole point of it is focused, to your point of what you said, it's focused on acquiring a business. That's all it's supposed to do. So when it does the IPO, they're looking to raise funds to actually purchase a business. So here, this particular blank check company, and most blank check companies are actually under rigorous scrutiny by the SEC. And one of the things that the SEC kind of calls it or refers to them as is a penny stock. Now, most of them, you don't have to be called a penny stock once you get over $5 a share. It's like $5 or $6 a share. But again, that shows you kind of how speculative the SEC deems this kind of right off top. Because it's basically just a company that exists for the purpose of acquiring another company. And to the point of time is that it does cut down a lot of the time that's involved with an IPO. To your point, IPOs can take as long as a year, but a acquisition through a blank check company or SPAC is about 90 days. So it cuts it by 75%. That's a big deal, especially when you're trying to get the first mover advantage, basically get out in the market as quickly as possible. Adding an IPO to the mix is just not going to do it. So that really does kind of cut the time off. And then also marketing. You can market a acquisition differently through this process than you can an IPO. There's a lot of rules and regulations about how you can talk about an IPO versus how you can talk about a special acquisition. And then finally, I think it's like we kind of talked about, is that when you have a private company, it's not very liquid. I can't just go, if I start, the Courtney Richardson LLC, I can't just go out on the street and kind of sell my shares. I mean, well, LLCs don't have shares, but either way, I can't just go on the street and just kind of sell my business. I have to, go another way. So if I'm a private company, what's the best way for me to sell my shares is to actually just get on board with a company that's already publicly traded. So that's kind of where we are now in the cannabis space. So the company that we're talking about is MTech Acquisition, and they IPO'd in January of 2018. And one of the things about the blank check company that I want to talk about is that the SEC, like with their regulations, requires that the money that is raised in an IPO has to go into escrow. Like it can't just be floating around. I believe it's like 80% has to go to escrow, and they have about 2 years as per the SEC to make an acquisition, or the money goes back to shareholders. But here, the MTech documents, the SEC documents, they're whatever the documents are, I forgot today. But the IPO documents actually said they had 18 months as opposed to the traditional 2 years. I thought that was really interesting. And also, one of the interesting things is that you cannot have a target. You can't, a company as a blank check company cannot have a target already in mind when it actually forms. And if so, they have to do a series of disclosures to give that to investors so they have a full idea of what's going on. So it makes sense that once the company forms, is that they really do a good search out there, because they can't really do that search beforehand based on the rules and regulations of the SEC. And the SEC is already looking at these funky anyway, like, we don't really love them. And especially with them being so much, it's kind of a function of how do we do this in a different way. So I thought it was really interesting that they were able to find a company so quickly, but I think that's more of a testament to where the cannabis business is going, kind of when we talk about the puck, more so than anything else.
Yeah, no, definitely. So before we get into, I think, vehicles, I think it's also important to note that ultimately, if you're going to invest in a company, you actually need fundamentals of the company. Mm-hmm. So I'd say let's actually talk about the application, or the, so like there's the blank check vehicle, and this is obviously call it a complicated transaction, right? It's not like just buying a stock, because yes, you're buying a stock, but you're buying not the stock of the company. You've got to realize, you've got to say, this is who they're buying, right? Like you've got to look at who they're buying and what they're doing. You need to be on board with that, because a blank check that you're buying into is just a blank check, right? It's like, oh, what are they going to do? So why don't we maybe back off on the structure side and let's talk about the actual picks and shovels application, because I'm actually more excited about that. And I don't know if you know, for me, I'm a tech guy. I spent a good deal of my career in technology and in software. So I'm comfortable with technology, and I just like tech companies because they just make sense. So let's just pop this up. So obviously we've talked a little bit about the SPAC or the blank check, but let's actually look at the company that will soon be formed through this blank check transaction. So I'm going to pull them up on the screen, and we'd love to kind of get your opinion. So this is a company called MJ Freeway. And MJ Freeway is on their website, it's an ERP for the cannabis industry. So experience the power of the platform. Do you want to did you look at MJ Freeway? Do you want to maybe just present them, or let's talk about them before we dive in? Because I can talk about this all day, but I just feel because I am a tech and a software person, I may be beeping and clicking so that like normal people don't understand what I'm actually saying, right?
So please correct. So this is definitely your bag, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So from what I'm understanding of MJ Freeway, it is a Colorado company, or a company based in Colorado that focuses on a seed to sale technology. When we talk about seed to sale, we mean pretty much from the plant all the way to the ultimate consumer. So there's lots of things that happen along the path. And MJ Freeway seems to be involved in all of it. It basically has 3 lines of business. So it has a platform that does compliance tracking from seed to sale for businesses, so for private businesses. And then it also has another system that's set up for the government that actually allows the government to do seed to sale tracking also. And then finally, it has a consulting side. So there's basically 3 lines of business that this company has. So basically, it's a software as a service. So it's pretty much like it's a straight tech cannabis company, but it provides support to the cannabis, infrastructure all the way through. And I thought it was really interesting because one of the government contracts that the company has is with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And it requires, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania requires each of its stores and companies kind of across the board to actually use the MJ technology. Like they can't use anything else as part of like the contract of them doing business. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of like what it's doing. But it's, for the most part, it's a full service cannabis company in terms of support. So it does a lot of, I have like in my notes, I'm just looking at my notes real quick. Pretty much it does, I don't want to say everything, but just like that back office, it does some HR support. Let's see, I have stuff everywhere. So, but it does much more than HR support. But it's just really a tech company that supports the business of cannabis, and it does it.
You're actually in Pennsylvania too, right? So this is a little near and dear to your heart.
It is. It was so interesting. So I was like, oh, I had no idea. And it's a 5-year contract in Pennsylvania. So I thought that was pretty cool.
So I think to clarify, and just so people recognize, this company, this is what we call a picks and shovels play, right? They're not in the business of growing flower. They're not selling products. They're not doing extraction, but they are similar to, the picks and shovels story, right? Are you going to go mine for gold? Or are you going to sell, jeans and clothes and picks and shovels to gold miners? MJ Freeway is what we call a picks and shovels type of company. And what they do is they're kind of like, let's see, let me think of a good analogy. They're kind of like, if I'm going to work and I need a computer, right? And it's software, right? So Windows, for example, would be the operating system I use so that I can actually work and do my I can do my work and do my computing and everything on my hardware. So what MJ Freeway does is they are a operating system, but more for businesses, for dispensaries, for growers, and extraction companies and manufacturers. So this is kind of like the glue or the engine that holds the cannabis dispensary together, right? So they might have a point of sale system tying into a cash register, tying into some inventory system, tying into their manufacturing. And it's critical to understand why these guys sit here and why they're important is because the cannabis industry is incredibly regulated. So depending on the market, and especially when we're talking medical markets, and Pennsylvania is a medical market, and I don't know the Pennsylvania rules, but I know, for example, in a certain state, if you are a medical patient, you actually have your plant that's tied to your prescription. And that plant is sitting at a dispensary that grows at that dispensary. And then from the seed to the actual leaf to the actual consumption, all that stuff is tracked, all that stuff is tagged. People have to have an audit trail from start to finish because those are the government regulations around medicinal marijuana. So what they do is once a dispensary uses them, they are the operating system of the business. So I like this business a lot because it's an incredibly sticky business. So I'm not sure if you've ever, dealt with this, but I look at myself, I happen to use Androids, the Android phones, and that's my operating system for my phone. And my daughter uses an iPhone, so she uses the Apple system. And I've talked to her, she looked at, I've got a Google Pixel. She was looking at the Google Pixel, liked it because the camera was nicer and everything. But for her to switch to the Google Pixel, she has to relearn how to use all the apps, right? Because she's got the Apple app, she's got iCloud, she's got all that stuff that's tied in. Likewise, for me to switch from Google to an iPhone, I've got to, my stuff synced into my Google Drive. I've got my Play Store. I've got all that stuff that's tied in. That's really tough. So now this is as a personal side, and it's one thing for a person to do something, but now you imagine these operating systems for a business, right? So it's like if you're trained, you've got your dispensary and you've got 5 locations, you've got a multi-state location, and all your employees or the people are trained on using this sort of cash register, and they're used to scanning these codes and the technology that's powering their plants and that's hooked into their systems. I mean, it's all the same. To actually pull that out of a business and basically redo it or relearn it, I mean, it's a root canal. I mean, and that's saying it nicely on that front. And,
well, I think you make a really good point. I think you can even compare it to what we would call when you have a bank. I think a lot of people will appreciate that. You have your direct deposit, you have your automatic bill pay. To do all of that as a person, that's a lot. So imagine that 10 times.
Oh, yeah. And then it's not even that. A lot of times these systems are all the processes and all the training is built around these systems, right? So if you're used to pressing the green button that does this, or if you're using to filling out the form this way, if you go to a different system, they might have a red button. They might not have a button. There's all those things, right? And you're talking about, I mean, it's I guess, it's like driving, right? If you're used to driving on the right side of the road and then you go to another country, England or Japan, you have to drive on the other side of the road. It's different. It's scary. It's a lot. And it's one thing if it's a startup business and they don't have any processes or anything in play. But once a customer is generally on some sort of an ERP or on such a system and they're a functioning business, I mean, no business is going to shut down for 3 weeks to renovate, just to relearn something. What the company has to basically implode or do something really awful, or the other competitor has to offer so much more to get a switch. Does that make sense?
Right.
So I look at sorry, go ahead.
I said, no, that's that first. And that's the thing. This is the only one doing it. This is pretty much the ultimate first mover advantage.
Yeah. So what I like I like this. And to give people examples, maybe some, if you don't get it, what are other examples? And I always like to study history to see what other people have done. Maybe there isn't cannabis history, but there's similar type, ERP is not a new thing. ERP has been around. ERP to cannabis is the new change because it's a new industry. So what are ERP or SaaS sort of operating system companies in other markets? One is a company called Oracle. Are you familiar with Oracle at all, or have you heard about them before, Courtney? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So Oracle was one of these, call it platform companies 20 years ago in the internet space. And they developed this thing called the relational database that essentially every internet technology company and almost every company has built their technology around this concept of a database. And for people who are familiar with Oracle or who were aware of them 20 years ago, they blew up and they were one of the big darlings of the business-to-business technology space. If you go back, the founder of Oracle was a guy called Larry Ellison. And back in early 2000s, it was Bill Gates and Larry Ellison were the two big dogs of technology. And Oracle's one of those companies. Another company that's a little more modern that some people might even have heard of or might be invested in is a company called Salesforce.com. So Salesforce, what they've built, right, is they built, in their case, it's a CRM, it's a platform, and it's for salespeople. But what that happens is if you're a salesperson and your company uses Salesforce, the person then, all your leads, all your contacts, all your orders, all the things that you do is housed in Salesforce. And Salesforce then becomes kind of the operating system or the glue that helps your company run. So these are examples, right? And if you're able to catch, the glue, the picks and shovels, these companies are incredibly sticky because it's all the things, right? Usually it's some sort of a recurring revenue type business model. And unless the actual business goes out of business, they're probably not going to go away. Make sense?
No, I agree. I completely agree. It's just about being very, and I think that's I giggle. I'm like, oh, sticky business, sticky service, haha. But I think that's a really big deal because when you're looking at a company and you're looking to even consider possibly investing, you want to look to your point about the puck. And I just love Wayne Gretzky's, I think it belonged to Wayne Gretzky, his analogy saying you want to go where the puck is going. And again, if we think, I mean, just kind of talking about logic, if we think that cannabis is kind of like the next big industry, then the question is, then what is out there to support it as being the next big industry? And that's where we should be looking with kind of all of these supports. And I just think it's really interesting that there's only one company that does it on this level and one company that kind of does an interface between private and public kind of works, considering that this is pretty much a private and public workspace.
Yeah, no, it's great. Now, there is competition. I mean, they are not the only people in the market, but they do, I think, have about, I forget what their S1 said, but I think they have about 30, they're saying about 30 to 35% market share. So,
okay.
In a decentralized, I mean, you're talking 30% of all the dispensaries. So I think I read their filing and I don't recall, but I think they've got over 1,000. Let me see. I'm going to stop my share and let me see if I can go pull up their, call it financial data in terms of what I've got. But let's see. Here we go. Here are some notes. Let me go pull this up real quick. My notes are saying they currently, let me go find this. Shows they currently have about it looks like they have clients in 11 of 13 countries with legal cannabis. So, they've got some pretty good market share and some pretty good market penetration. They have over 1,000 dispensaries or growers who are their customers. So that's kind of exciting. They processed $10 billion worth of transactions. So people who actually bought flour and everything like that, all those people processed or, used them in the cash registers or grew this stuff through their platform. And let's see, they've been recognized. Let me see. Oh, I found a nice article. They've been recognized in the Inc. 500 as one of the fastest growing companies in the United States multiple times. So this is kind of cool, right? So even though we don't have all the info on them right now, we can take a look, right? So we can see this, they're recognized 3-year revenue growth of 226%. Yeah, and then we could probably even go to and see like what are their revenues and everything. Yeah, so they were number 1975 on the list. So it looks pretty good. I think I'm looking at.
My concern was I did see in their docs that they were saying that they're scheduled to be profitable in 2021. So I was like, oh, okay. I mean, which is not strange. Let me back up. That's not kind of a non-starter. It's just something that I took under advisement because a lot of these opening or starting tech companies, they just aren't profitable when they start off the gate. So that wasn't a big deal, but I just thought it was interesting of when they were looking to think that they would be profitable.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that, I guess the question to ask, there's no question that there definitely is some risk involved, right? It's a startup company. I think it's it's interesting though. So now let's have a compare and contrast, because the reality is, if you want to bring up Tilray or Canopy Growth, they're not profitable either.
Right, exactly. And right? I think that's a hallmark of the industry at this point. I think very few are profitable. I think some, like maybe one or two of the big, like five, one of them or two of them may be profitable. But they're the smaller versions. So I think that to talk about that they're not profitable yet. So
I mean, it's like I said, there's definitely, I actually found the link to the SEC regs. So I'm going to just post this up and let's share and run through these with everybody who's tuning in, because it's great information. Let me see. Let me enlarge this so it's a little more readable, right? So here's the company, blah, 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 blah. All these sorts of things. There's a transactional overview, and we'll probably have to do another part 3 on this, because we just dove into this. So, I mean, you look at the business, you're right. I mean, you look at it in 2017, you've got a big red number here. In 2018, you also have a big red number. Moving forward, 2019 and 2020, you also have red numbers. So it's going to be some time for it to be fully profitable, right? They're not talking until 2021. I think what's worthwhile noting, though, is, right, these guys, 2018, you're talking $10.5 million in revenue. Okay? So, I mean,
that's over 17. So that's a double over. That's very big. Just to kind of double your numbers in a year is a big deal for a business.
Correct. So if we look at that, and again, I'm not saying that this company is perfect and, and everything, we're analyzing this. So I like the fact that you challenge some of our thoughts, because this makes the discussion better for, myself, and I'm sure for all our listeners, they can see, right? But let's take a look at, what do you want to do, Tilray or Canopy Growth?
I think Tilray to me is a little bit more. I think we beat up on Canopy.
Okay. Well, I'm not saying we're beating up on Canopy. I would just say we are skeptical about the perspective as an investor. Keep in mind, right? We're subsetting down. I'm not saying I don't care if the company grows, because it does matter, because ultimately we're investing in what we think are going to be the winners for tomorrow. But I also care about, as an investor, is my money going to grow? Because that's ultimately my number one thing, right? As an investor, I'm here for myself. I don't want the company to grow and then me not. Right. And that happens too. I mean, there's wildly successful companies that don't quite grow. So
I think looking at Tilray, I think it's very, very, very important to look at them, especially given that they just IPO'd. Their lockup period just ended maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Looking at them as a company, because they're I guess they are kind of like the cautionary tale of what we call cannabis, if that makes sense.
Because buy high, sell low, right?
Right. So you look at it and it blew up in September, October, it went all the way up to like $300 sometime like mid trading day in September. And then it like did I call it the electric slide down to, I mean, we're looking at 80. I mean, that's a huge difference. If you jumped in maybe somewhere around 200 and you're looking at your investment and it's now, less than half of what you put in. And I think that's why I wanted us to look at Tilray as opposed to Canopy, because nothing's really worked like that just yet.
Let's go take a quick look at the chart, so you can, let me see how do I get back here? Right. Nothing like watching a chart and seeing it go up and down. Hold on. We got the interactive version. Let's go the 1 year version. And yeah, exactly right. We have on the right here, what is that? $22 IPO. Boom, boom, boom. I don't see 300. I see 214. Oh, wait, no, there is a high of 300. Oh, wow.
Yeah, it hit like mid-trading day one day. It was really weird.
Crazy.
Right.
And then like, oh.
Right.
Oh, man.
So you see that, and then, you can kind of see, and it kind of leveled out from there. I mean, you do see some peaks since from that huge drop, but it's a big, that's kind of like the cautionary tale. That's what we look at. That's what everyone says, like buy low, sell high, don't do the opposite, blah, blah, blah. Like that's what we have. And that's really one of the problems here. So I wanted to look at them kind of in context.
Yeah, no, that's something, right? So, I mean, you even look at the numbers, and I think we talked about it. I mean, we look at these numbers. I mean, let's go quarterly so we can get even the more recent data. I mean, you're talking 10 million in revenue a quarter. So they're growing, so it's not bad, but they're 40 million a year. And at $40 million a year, their valuation is $7.8 billion.
Yeah.
That's pretty high. Now, I'm not going to project or anything like that because that's pushing it, because I think this valuation is a little astronomical, and I would never get into Tilray. But I guess if I look at this from an investment thesis perspective, we're probably gonna have to wrap up. So whoever's still tuning in, if you like this and you want to, if you want more of this, comment and let us know if we should continue on this or if we should change the topic. But if I'm looking at these two companies, on the right hand, I've got Tilray, which is a producer, right? So they're in Canada. They're going to get into the US one of these days. They obviously can't because of the whole legal side. Maybe they'll get into hemp, and they're trying to become a grower or one of the stronger consumer brands in the cannabis space. So I've got them on the one hand. On the other hand, I've got the company that's one of the market leaders in the space that services more than 1,000 other companies. Some of them are, I don't know if Tilray's a customer or not. I don't have any insider information, so I don't know that. But they're servicing potentially Tilray, potentially a company Tilray is going to buy. If Tilray goes into Pennsylvania, Tilray has to become a customer of theirs. And they've got 1,000 other, call it mini Tilrays or mini Canopy Growths and everything on that front. And I don't know about you, but the way I like to look at that is like, hey, I'm going to bet, like, if Tilray becomes the king or if Canopy Growth becomes the king, oh, of course, like, they're going to blow up, I mean, like, they're going to be massive. Like, it's the next Coca-Cola or the next Altria, or the next, Constellation Brands. And obviously Constellation and these guys have invested in that. But do I want to bet on that at this valuation, or do I want to get into someone else who has 1,000 shots on goal, right? And I think it's also worth noting, even though MJ Freeway might not be sexy, for anyone who wants a comp, and again, comps are for, history doesn't repeat, history rhymes. So just because it's something like that happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to continue. But if you look at a comp, go check out Salesforce.com. And if you're looking at Salesforce or if you're checking at them, I mean, when Salesforce, go look at Salesforce.com. So let's go, we can pull them up. on that front. And Salesforce.com has performed really well throughout the years. Now, Salesforce.com, unless you're in the, call it sales or software space, you don't know who they are. But, you know, so like their customers are household names and household brands out there. Let me just pull this out real quick. Yahoo Finance is taking a second to load. Here we go. You look at Salesforce.com, and like I said, it's not an exact change because Salesforce was CRM, but they also like we can get into like the specifics. But Salesforce.com in the business-to-business space in terms of servicing small to medium and even large enterprises that need their enterprise software for their sales team, they've managed to grow themselves to a $100 billion plus market cap. And still, for many people, are still very bullish about them. If you look at their growth over the years, let's just go back in time on that. You know, this is a play. It's not sexy, but it's plumbing, it's picks and shovels. In this case, it was the sales industry. They've done all right. You're muted, Courtney. You muted yourself.
Oh, sorry. No, I see it. It actually does. You can see the astronomical growth. Yeah.
So, I mean, like I said, hard to say. I think let's dive. We'll continue. We're running out of time now, so we need to get this wrapped up. But I think it's a good discussion to have in terms of the picks and shovels. To recap, we both believe in, you know, I believe, you know, this green rush or cannabis is here and it's going to stay and it's going to grow. I also believe we are in a bubble, but a bubble as it pertains to certain cannabis stocks. And I believe that for the right person, if you sniff into the right spot, there are great white space opportunities that we can get ahead on. So with that, thanks everyone for tuning in. Going to sound off. Do you have any final words to wrap up, Courtney, or are you ready to go?
No, I think you covered most of it. I mean, I'm really excited about what this is going to look like moving forward, and we'll see.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll be back next Tuesday, and we'll talk soon. Talk to you guys later.